The morning of Tuesday, October 4th arrived the way most October mornings do in downtown Hartford. Gray, cold, and indifferent to everything happening beneath it. The lobby of the Hargrove Financial Group headquarters sat at the corner of Main and Asylum, 38 floors of glass and polished granite that had been purchased, renamed, and recapitalized 3 times in 15 years, most recently by its current owner and CEO, Diane Hargrove. The building smelled like money, fresh carpeting, recirculated cold air, and the faint chemical sweetness of new leather furniture that had never once been sat in comfortably. At 6:47 that morning, a man named Marcus pushed a yellow mop bucket through the service entrance on the building's north side. He wore a gray maintenance uniform, the kind with a sewn-on name patch and a collar that sits slightly stiff at the neck no matter how many times you wash it. His boots were work boots, the kind that have been resoled at least once. He moved without hurry, without announcement, pushing that bucket through the corridor the way a man moves through a place where no one expects him to have a name. At 7:14, Diane Hargrove arrived. She stepped out of a black car with a calendar full of acquisition meetings, a 4th cup of coffee in one hand, and the particular posture of a person who has learned to walk through a room as if the room were grateful she'd arrived. She crossed the lobby at pace, phone lifted, heels precise on the marble floor. She didn't see Marcus until her heel caught the edge of the wet floor sign he had placed at the base of the main elevator bank, the sign with a yellow plastic triangle and the silhouette of a falling figure. The sign that is visible to everyone in the building except the one person who decides what the building is worth. Coffee went sideways. Not all of it. Enough. Oh, for the love of, she turned, found Marcus 3 feet behind her, mop in hand, watching her the way a man watches something he has already calculated and cannot change. Can you not put these signs somewhere people can actually see them? Marcus looked at the sign. It was where it needed to be. Directly beside the wet surface it was marking. He said nothing for 2 seconds. Then quietly, "I can move it, ma'am." Diane made a sound that was not quite a word and moved toward the elevator. She did not look back. The people around her, the lobby receptionist, a junior analyst carrying a laptop bag, watched Marcus the way people watch someone absorb something they themselves would not have absorbed quietly. Marcus moved the sign 6 inches to the left. He returned to his mop. He did not change his expression. His hands were still. Here is what Diane Hargrove did not know as she rode that elevator to her 38th floor corner office. The man she had just spoken to that way, the man with the mop and the resoled boots and the gray uniform and the name patch, owned the majority stake in a real estate portfolio whose independent appraised value, as of the prior fiscal quarter, was $47.2 million. He had chosen, for reasons of his own, not to tell her that. He had also not told her that he was specifically interested in this building. Her building, and that the quiet work he had come here to do had nothing to do with the mop. Listen closely, because what happened over the next 30 days changed something in every person who was present to witness it. And the most important change was not in Marcus. Marcus Tillman was 43 years old, and the only story most people bothered to learn about him was the one that fit in a sentence. Divorced father, lost his firm, raising his daughter alone. The fuller story was this. 11 years earlier, Marcus had co-founded a commercial real estate consultancy called Ridgeline Capital Partners with his then business partner, a man named Dennis Faree. In the years that followed, Ridgeline had grown steadily and quietly. No flashy offices, no splashy press releases, until it managed a portfolio of mid-market commercial properties across 3 New England states. Marcus ran operations. Dennis ran relationships. That division of labor had worked for 6 years, until the morning Marcus arrived at the office and found the locks had been changed, and a letter from a law firm informing him that Dennis had executed a provision in their partnership agreement. One Marcus's distracted attorney had failed to flag, that permitted a buyout under specific performance conditions. The conditions had been engineered. The buyout was legal. Marcus walked away from 11 years of work with a settlement that, after legal fees, amounted to $218,400 and a non-compete clause that remained in effect for 3 years. His marriage had not survived the fallout. Not because his wife, Carla, was cruel, but because grief and financial collapse and two people coping differently in a small house has a weight that very few relationships can carry. By the time the divorce was finalized, Marcus had full custody of his daughter, Nadia, who was 7 years old and had her mother's eyes and her father's way of going still when she was thinking. On the morning of the day he pushed that mop through the Hargrove lobby, Marcus had driven to work in a 2009 Chevy Silverado that needed a new alternator and smelled perpetually of pine tree air freshener. Nadia had asked him at breakfast. She always asked at breakfast, over the same bowl of oatmeal with the same arrangement of banana slices, whether they were going to the fall festival at her school that weekend. He had said yes. She had nodded once, as if that had settled a matter of considerable importance, and returned to her banana slices. Their apartment was on the 3rd floor of a building in Wethersfield. 2 bedrooms, adequate heat, a kitchen window that looked out on a parking lot, and a wall in Nadia's room that she had covered with drawings she made on the backs of envelopes. Horses mostly. One drawing that Marcus had quietly taped up himself. A man and a small girl holding hands in front of what was unmistakably a very large building. Had been up there so long its corners had begun to curl. The maintenance job at Hargrove Financial was not Marcus's only work. It was his access. The non-compete had expired 14 months earlier. In the time since, Marcus had been quietly reconstructing. He had used the settlement money as initial capital, added to it by negotiating a below-market acquisition of a distressed commercial property in Meriden, renovated it with contract crews he managed on weekends, and flipped it at a return that financed the next acquisition. And the one after that. He had done this without fanfare, without an office, without business cards. He worked out of a laptop at his kitchen table after Nadia went to sleep, and his notes were kept in a ledger. Handwritten, old-fashioned, the kind of detail that felt wrong and right at the same time. The maintenance job had been deliberate. Ridgeline, in its original form, had taught Marcus one principle above all others. The people who own buildings almost never actually know what is happening inside them. The man with the mop does. Marcus had spent 3 weeks inside the Hargrove building. Its mechanical systems, its occupancy patterns, its deferred maintenance schedule, its tenant complaints, learning exactly what the building was worth and what it would take to own it. On the morning of October 4th, he had been there for 22 days. He had 8 days left. When Nadia called him at lunch, she always called at lunch from the school's front office phone, a habit that had started when she was in 2nd grade and had simply never stopped. She asked him if his day was going okay. He said yes. He said good. She told him the horse in her drawing had a name now. He asked what it was. Steadfast, she said, with the gravity of someone who had considered this carefully. Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then, that's a good name. The work Marcus was doing inside the Hargrove building was, on its surface, straightforward maintenance. Mopping the lobby each morning before business hours, cleaning the executive corridor on the 32nd and 33rd floors, servicing the restrooms on floors 8 through 14. He did this work without complaint and without conversation, moving through the building the way water moves through a system, finding the path that leads to what matters. What he was actually collecting in those early morning hours before the building filled with people was information. He noted which mechanical systems were operating below standard. The HVAC units on floors 9 through 12 that had been repaired rather than replaced, and that would require full replacement within 18 to 24 months at an estimated cost of $340,000. He documented the tenant activity on the commercial floors. 3 of the 7 mid-level tenants were operating month to month without renewed leases, a structural vulnerability in the building's income profile that would not appear in a standard due diligence review unless someone knew where to look. He had photographed the parking structure's lower level. the water intrusion along the north retaining wall, the concrete spalling that had been painted over, not repaired. He kept these notes in his phone under a folder labeled ETK, Nadia's middle name, and the abbreviation he'd always used for need to know. The person who noticed Marcus first was a woman named Pearl Okonkwo, who managed facilities operations for the building's property management subcontractor. Pearl was 61, had worked in commercial building management for 34 years, and had a reputation for observing things that other people, in the course of being important, failed to notice. She noticed, on the 9th morning of Marcus's contract, that the floors in the executive corridor were slightly cleaner than they needed to be. Not just mopped, assessed, she would later say when she described it, as if someone who understood the floor was cleaning it, not just someone who had been assigned to. She found him in the utility corridor on the 12th floor on a Wednesday morning, filling his mop bucket, and she stood in the doorway for a moment before she spoke. "You were in property management," Pearl said. It was not a question. Marcus looked up from the bucket. He held her gaze for a moment. "Something like that. Which side? Acquisition? Operations?" Pearl folded her arms and leaned against the doorframe, considering him with an expression that was neither hostile nor entirely friendly. It was the expression of someone calibrating. "Building's been on informal market for 8 months, she said. Owner thinks she's holding out for top dollar. She's actually just letting the deferred maintenance discount the asset slower than it should be going." "I know," Marcus said. Pearl was quiet for several seconds. Then, "She treated you poorly last Tuesday." "She treated the uniform poorly," Marcus said. "That's different." Pearl made a small sound, not quite a laugh but in the vicinity of one, and pushed off the doorframe. "There's a tenant on 26 who's been quietly shopping for a better deal for 3 months, she said. His lease expires March 1st. That's something a potential buyer should probably know." She paused at the corridor's end. "I'm going to pretend this conversation didn't happen." "That's sensible," Marcus said. In the weeks that followed, Marcus worked the information Pearl had given him alongside everything he had gathered himself. He retained a commercial real estate attorney, a woman named Josephine Creel, who had worked with Marcus in the Ridgeline days and who had been waiting, she said, for him to call, and began the process of structuring an acquisition offer through a holding company he'd established the previous March under the name Tillman Capital Group. The holding company's name did not appear anywhere in the building's maintenance records, contractor agreements, or visitor logs. Nadia appeared on his refrigerator that week in a new drawing, this one of a man in a suit standing in front of the same large building from her bedroom wall. She had drawn it, Marcus realized, from a photograph she'd seen on his laptop screen. He had not noticed her looking. He put it up beside the grocery list without comment. The complication came on the morning of October 19th. Dennis Furry called. Marcus had not spoken to Dennis in 8 years. He let the call go to voicemail, and when he listened to the message, it was 3 minutes of carefully constructed language that amounted to one piece of information. Dennis had learned through a broker contact that the Hargrove building was in play. He did not know who the potential buyer was. He was reaching out to see if Marcus had any interest in partnering on an acquisition. Marcus listened to the message twice. He set the phone down on the kitchen table. Outside, Wethersfield was making the particular sounds of a weekday morning. Bus brakes, distant traffic, a dog somewhere barking twice and then stopping. He did not call Dennis back. But the call itself meant something had changed. The acquisition was no longer invisible. The first crisis arrived on the morning of October 21st, and it arrived the way the worst things tend to. Not loudly, but through someone else's mouth. Marcus arrived at the service entrance at 6:32, 4 minutes earlier than usual, and found the building's facilities supervisor, a man named Roger Cass, waiting for him in the corridor outside the supply room. Roger managed the maintenance contractor's personnel on site and had, over the 3 weeks of Marcus's contract, treated him with a particular brand of performative authority that men sometimes exercise over other men they have decided to see as subordinate. On that morning, Roger's expression was different. He was holding a printed email, and the printed email had come from Diane Hargrove's office. "There's been a complaint," Roger said. "Someone in the executive corridor says items have been moved on their desk after cleaning visits. There's a concern about unauthorized access." Marcus understood in that moment what this was. It was not a coincidence that the complaint had materialized 3 days after Dennis Ferry's phone call. Someone had learned enough to want Marcus gone before he completed his assessment. "I follow the cleaning protocol exactly," Marcus said. "I don't touch anything on any surface I'm not directed to clean." "I understand that." But the complaint came from the CEO's assistant, and Roger held up a hand that was meant to convey reasonableness and conveyed only discomfort. "I have to put you on suspension pending review. But you won't be in the building while it's investigated." Marcus stood in that corridor for a full 4 seconds without speaking. He looked at the supply room door, the same door he had passed through every morning for 22 days. He looked at his hands, which were at his sides. "How long?" he said. "A week. Maybe less." He walked back out to the parking lot, got into the Silverado, and sat for 7 minutes. A week was enough time for another buyer to move. If Dennis had a contact inside the broker network, and if that contact knew the building was in play, a suspension that cleared Marcus from the building meant a week during which he could not verify or update his operational assessment. Any offer he placed without current information was an offer built on incomplete ground. And incomplete ground in a $9 million acquisition was the kind of error that cost you the deal or cost you afterward. His attorney, Josephine, said it plainly when he called her from the parking lot. "We can challenge the suspension, but that takes time we don't have. Can you get what you need another way?" Marcus thought about Pearl Okonkwo. He thought about the HVAC reports Pearl had mentioned, offhandedly, were filed with the city's Commercial Property Inspection Office as part of a routine compliance submission. He thought about the tenant on 26, whose broker contact could be identified through public commercial lease filings. "I can work around it," he told Josephine. "Then work around it," she said. "And file the LOI by Friday. We don't have the luxury of waiting." He worked for 3 days from the kitchen table, from a library corral, from the parking lot of the city building department, where he spent 4 hours reading inspection filings that were public record and that no one, apparently, had thought to read before him. Nadia was at school during the days and beside him in the evenings, doing homework at the kitchen table with the focused silence of a child who has learned to be present without being a disruption. She did not ask why he was home. She did not ask why his laptop was open at 11 at night. She had her horse drawings and her banana slices and her quiet faith in the steadiness of the man sitting across from her. On the second night, she put a piece of paper on his laptop keyboard without a word and went to bed. He looked at it. It was a drawing of a man holding a key, standing in front of a building. Underneath it, in her careful second-grade handwriting, she had written 2 words. "Go, Daddy." Marcus looked at that drawing for a long time. His hands were still. The internal crisis came the following morning, and it was quieter than the external one, which is always the way with the crises that matter most. He sat with his coffee at 5:47 and he considered, in the particular lucid hour before the day begins its noise, whether any of this was worth the cost at which it was proceeding. He was 43 years old. He had $311,000 in liquid capital, a holding company with 2 assets, and a non-binding letter of intent to file on a $9 million building by Friday, which was 36 hours from now. The financing was structured. A regional commercial bank had given him a preliminary indication, not a commitment. The holding company was real, but it was young. The deal was possible, but it was fragile in the way that all deals built in the shadow of a non-compete and a betrayal and a slow, private reconstruction are fragile. He thought about Dennis Ferry. He thought about the locks changing 11 years ago. He thought about the settlement that had felt, in the weeks after, like a door not just closing but being removed from the building entirely. He did not think, I deserve this. He had learned in the years since Ridgeline that deserving has nothing to do with it. What mattered was not the size of the injustice but the quality of the response. He had built Ridgeline once with nothing more than a methodology, a work ethic, and a willingness to do the work that other people in the industry found too slow and too careful. He could build something again. He thought about Nadia. He thought about GoDaddy. He thought about a horse named Steadfast. He closed the coffee cup, opened the laptop, and called Josephine. I want to file Thursday evening, he said. Not Friday. Josephine was quiet for a moment. That's aggressive. I know. I'll have the documents ready by 5. The letter of intent was filed at 6:17 p.m. on Thursday, October 27. Tillman Capital Group's offer for the Hargrove building. $8.65 million, all cash, 30-day close. No contingencies except title. Marcus drove home, picked up Nadia from his neighbor's apartment, and made dinner. She talked about the fall festival and about Steadfast and about a boy in her class who had apparently said something incorrect about horses. Marcus listened to all of it. He asked questions at the right moments. He felt, sitting at that kitchen table, not triumphant. Not yet, but something quieter and more solid. The particular feeling of a man who has done everything he was capable of doing and must now simply wait for the world to respond. The world, as it turned out, was about to respond very loudly. The response arrived not with a phone call from a broker, but with a Monday morning meeting that Diane Hargrove had called at 9 a.m. on October 31st. Halloween, in the 38th floor conference room with a view of the Hartford skyline and the 4 chairs that were always perfectly aligned with the table's edge. She had called the meeting because 2 hours earlier, her personal attorney had sent her the LOI documentation with a note that read, "You need to understand who this is before you make a decision." Attached to that note was a background report on Tillman Capital Group, and attached to that report was a profile of its principal, Marcus Tillman, complete with a photograph that Josephine Creel's firm used in its correspondence, the one where Marcus was wearing the gray suit he bought for the Ridgeline partner presentations, standing in front of a building that was not the Hargrove building. The same Marcus Tillman who had been pushing a mop through her lobby for 3 weeks. The meeting had 4 people in it when Marcus arrived. Diane Hargrove, her personal attorney David Wills, the building's listing broker, and Pearl Okonkwo, who had been summoned without being told why and who, when she saw Marcus walk through the conference room door in a charcoal wool suit and a white shirt with no tie, made a sound that was almost entirely silent and then pressed her lips together and looked straight ahead. Marcus carried a leather portfolio that he set on the table without opening it. He sat across from Diane Hargrove and waited. It was David Wills who spoke first. He was a compact man with careful hair and a manner that suggested he had delivered uncomfortable information in conference rooms many times and had developed, over the years, a kind of professional cushioning for it. "Mr. Tillman," he said, "I think we should acknowledge that this situation is irregular." "In what way?" Marcus said. Wills looked at his client then back. "You were employed in this building in a maintenance capacity during the same period you were preparing a purchase offer." "I was retained by a maintenance contractor," Marcus said. "The contractor has a facilities agreement with the property. I performed the work assigned to me, within the terms of that agreement, and I did not misrepresent myself to the contractor or to anyone else. My legal identity and my business identity are a matter of public record." Diane Hargrove had been watching Marcus since he walked in the door, and she had the expression of someone recalibrating a calculation they had believed to be finished. Her hands were flat on the table. She was very still. "You were in my building," she said. "I was," Marcus said. "You," she stopped. Started again. "You cleaned my floors." "I did," he said. "Among other things." Diane Hargrove looked at her attorney. David Wills looked at his notes. The listing broker, a man whose name was Carl something and who had spent the entire meeting looking as if he would prefer to be somewhere else, was looking out the window at the Hartford skyline with the focused neutrality of a man who has decided this is not his problem. Pearl Okonkwo, in the chair at the corner of the table, was looking at Marcus with an expression that was very close to satisfaction. Not the sharp kind, but the warm, slow kind. The kind that comes from having recognized something before others did. Diane Hargrove said, "Why?" Marcus held her gaze for a moment. His voice was quiet and unhurried. He said, "Because buildings keep their secrets from people who only ever see them from the top floor." The room was very still. David Wills cleared his throat. "The offer is structured competitively," he began. "865 is." "I know what it is," Diane Hargrove said. She had not looked away from Marcus. She was quiet for a long time. Long enough that the room's ambient sounds became audible. The HVAC system cycling, the faint noise of the street 38 floors below, Pearl shifting slightly in her chair. Then Diane Hargrove picked up the LOI document and turned it to the signature page. She looked at it. She looked at Marcus. She said, "There will be conditions." "There are always conditions," Marcus said. She turned to her attorney. "Get me a purchase and sale agreement by Wednesday." She set the document back down, not dismissively, but with the precise weight of a person who has made a decision and is done deliberating. She looked at Marcus once more. Something moved across her face that was not quite remorse and not quite respect and was, maybe, the intersection between the two. "You should know," she said quietly, "that the suspension was not my instruction." Marcus nodded once. "I know," he said. David Wills was already on his phone. Carl the broker had turned from the window and was writing something down with the urgency of a man trying to demonstrate relevance. Pearl Okonkwo stood slowly, gathered her notepad, and as she passed behind Marcus's chair, she placed one hand briefly on his shoulder, a gesture so small and deliberate that no one else in the room appeared to notice it. The purchase and sale agreement was executed on November 14th. The closing took place on December 3rd, 30 days from the date of the letter of intent. Tillman Capital Group took ownership of the Hargrove building at 10:47 a.m. The title transfer document was signed by Marcus Tillman in a conference room 2 blocks away, not in the building itself. He would save that moment for later, when he could bring Nadia. He picked her up from school at 3 that afternoon. She got into the truck, buckled her seatbelt, and looked at him with a particular assessment of a child who can read her parents' face with precision. "You did it," she said. He didn't ask how she knew. "Yeah," he said. She leaned across the center console and pressed her head against his arm, not dramatically, not with ceremony, just quietly. The way she had sat beside him at the kitchen table on all those late nights, present without needing to announce herself. They drove home through the cold December afternoon, and Marcus's hands were steady on the wheel. 6 months later, the building on the corner of Main and Asylum Street carried new management signage on its lobby desk, new leases on 3 previously month-to-month commercial floors, and a completed HVAC replacement on floors 9 through 12 that had been completed under budget and on time. The parking structure's north wall had been waterproofed and repaired, not painted over. Pearl Okonkwo was now Director of Facilities Operations for Tillman Capital Group's Hartford portfolio, a title she had not been offered as much as she had been invited into, the way you invite someone to continue doing what they've always been doing but now with the recognition the work had always deserved. Nadia's drawing, the man holding a key in front of the building, had been framed and now hung in Marcus's new office on the 33rd floor. Beside it was a photograph of the two of them taken in that office on the first day Marcus had brought her in, Nadia in her school uniform, Marcus in his gray suit, both of them standing in front of the window that looked out over the city they lived in. On a Thursday in early spring, Pearl was walking a new facilities contractor through the lobby when the contractor, surveying the space, said something that stopped her mid-step. "Clean building," the contractor said, with the professional appreciation of someone who understood what that statement actually measured. "You can always tell a well-managed building by the floors." Pearl looked at the lobby floor. She looked at the service corridor entrance on the north side. Then she looked back at the contractor and said something that Marcus would later say was the most accurate summary he had ever heard of what the past year had meant. "Sometimes," Pearl told him, "the most dangerous person in a room is the one no one thinks to look at twice." Now, here is the question I want you to sit with, and I would genuinely like to read your perspective in the comments. Diane Hargrove did not create the suspension that removed Marcus from the building. She was told after the fact. Does that change how you see her? Is there a difference between the injustice a person commits directly and the one they benefit from without correcting? And what does that difference mean for the idea of accountability? I don't think there's a clean answer. That's exactly why I want to hear yours. Watch until the end of this video, because the reveal is not just who Marcus turns out to be. It is the moment Diane Hargrove realizes what she almost dismissed, and what that realization costs her.